Let's look at how Paul learned the gospel. Paul was one of the leaders in the early church. In Philippians 3, he describes his upbringing. He writes, I was circumcised when I was 8 days old. I'm a pure-blooded citizen of Israel and a member of the tribe of Benjamin, a real Hebrew if there ever was one. I was a member of the Pharisees who demand the strictest obedience to the Jewish law. I was so zealous that I harshly persecuted the church. And as for righteousness, I obeyed the law without a fault. So he was a Pharisee, which means he was a religious leader in his day. He had an incredible pedigree, and he was a pretty religious person. He thought he knew God already. And then it says this in Acts chapter 9, it tells the story of Paul. His name was Saul before he became a Christian. Meanwhile, Saul was uttering threats with every breath and was eager to kill the Lord's followers. So see, he was Jewish, a Pharisee, and he was against the Christians, which at this time in history was a sect within Judaism. It says, so he went to the high priest and he requested letters addressed to the synagogues in Damascus, asking for their cooperation in the arrest of any follower of the way he found there. The way is what Christianity was called at that time. It says he wanted to bring them, both men and women, back to Jerusalem in chains. So in his zeal, he was persecuting. This is what he said in Philippians 3. He was so zealous that he persecuted the church. And again, he thought he was on God's side. He thought he was doing the right thing. But look what it says in verse 3. And as he approached Damascus on his mission, a light from heaven suddenly shone down around him. And he fell to the ground and heard a voice saying to him, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? And Saul said, who are you, Lord? And the voice replied, I'm Jesus, the one you're persecuting. And Jesus said, now get up and go into the city, and you will be told what you must do. So right after this vision, Paul went to Damascus, and right there in Damascus, Paul put his faith in Jesus, and he got baptized. And look at what it says in verse 20. It says, immediately he began preaching about Jesus in the synagogues, saying, he is indeed the Son of God. And all who heard him were amazed. And they said, isn't this the same guy who caused such devastation among Jesus' followers in Jerusalem? And didn't he come here to arrest them and take them in chains to the leading priests? This is amazing how quickly Paul goes from persecuting the church to meeting Jesus and now telling other people that he was wrong, that Paul was wrong, and that Jesus really is God himself, and he went to the cross and he died. So this is how Paul not only learned the gospel, but immediately began telling other people about the gospel. And let's go back to Philippians 3 to see what he learned. He says this in verse 7. I once thought all these things, all the good things in his resume, all the things that he was so proud of, being a Pharisee and all that stuff. He says, I once thought all these things were valuable, but now I consider them worthless because of what Christ has done. Yes, everything else is worthless when compared with the infinite value of knowing Christ my Lord. For his sake I've discarded everything else, counting it all as garbage, so that I could gain Christ and become one with him. It's pretty impressive that a guy who was so proud of his accomplishments could come to this realization in his life. It's pretty obvious that Paul really did meet Jesus, and he really did hear the gospel. And here's the gospel. He says it right here in the next verse. I no longer count on my own righteousness through obeying the law. Rather, I become righteous through faith in Christ. This is what he learned. This is the gospel. We see it all over the place in the New Testament. He says, for God's way of making us right with himself depends on faith. It's a powerful story. It's a simple message. Why don't you talk about it for a minute?